A little bit about me. So I've been at BYU for the last 6 years. I'm an assistant professor of economics, as Haley mentioned. I also am the research director at the Science of Diversity and Inclusion, which is an initiative bringing together companies and researchers to trial different interventions and solutions to try and improve diversity, equity, and belonging in the workplace. And as Haley mentioned, I co-host a weekly seminar. It's an online seminar open to anybody on the research around economics of discrimination and disparities. And it's on my website. If you're ever interested in joining, you're more than welcome to. So today I'll be talking about recent research. Let me share the slides just to make sure we're actually looking at the same things here. I just have a quick deck so that you can see some of the results. And are you able to see me progress through the slides? Is it moving? Okay, great. Awesome. So I will be talking about recent research. This project is a few years in the making, and we finally have a paper that we're submitting for publication in academic journals and circulating the results. And this is joint work, as you can see, with two of my colleagues at BYU, looking at how gender composition of groups affects women's influence and overall group dynamics. So to motivate why we started thinking about this question, in recent years, this is of course going to come as no surprise to any of you in attendance. Concerns about lack of women's representation have led to various initiatives to try to diversify important decision-making bodies like corporate boards, teams at different companies, political boards, and school boards, and many associations and groups like these. But the thing about these initiatives is they vary quite a bit in their intensity. So I'll give you an example. Across many EU countries, various legislation has been passed to require corporate boards to have at least 40% of the board directors being female. Whereas in the US, that same kind of legislation was passed in only one state, in California in 2018. And the intensity of that regulation is very different. In particular, only 1 out of 5 directors on the boards of corporations registered in California have to be female. And anecdotal evidence suggests that many corporations in California have chosen to comply with the law by simply adding a lone woman to the otherwise or previously all-male boards. So pictures like these are not hard to find, not just in the corporate board setting, but across many different settings. And those of you here in attendance who are in the tech sector, either employed or studying, certainly are familiar with situations in which I think you've found yourself either one off or at least in the minority in similar ways as these women in these pictures have. And so the question that we wanted to address or ask in our research is, how does gender composition affect women's ability to exert influence in these kinds of settings? Because presumably, of course, the goal of these regulations is to add women so they can add their perspective, their insights, and actually contribute and influence the conversation around the table. We want to know whether women are able to do so when they find themselves in the minority. So do they actually face barriers to fully contributing their insights and expertise, even though they have a seat at the table? And more specifically, how do their experiences compare to the experiences of the women who are equally qualified, equally talented, but happen to be in the majority in the same kinds of settings? So to answer these questions, we conduct a field experiment, and I'm not sure how much you guys are familiar with the different research methods, but an experiment in economics is considered to be, much like in hard sciences, sort of the gold standard of research, and I'll explain why. So what we do is we partner with a top 10 accounting program in the US. This program, like many other programs in the US, especially in the business school, relies on relies on a pedagogical group-based approach, where when students are admitted into the program, they're assigned into groups or teams, and they work in those teams quite extensively throughout that semester. So in fact, we estimate that these students in our sample interact for about 20 hours a week on average. They work together on assignments, on cases, they meet socially. This is before COVID, when you could actually meet in person. So they interact quite intensively. These are groups of 5. And as you can see, women constitute quite a minority in this program. They're about 25% of all the students. And so historically, the way that these teams were assigned was done through placing 1 woman per team on average. And this was done in order to dilute the women, to have men have experience interacting with women as they go out into professional settings. And so that was the status quo. We came in and we convinced the program to try to randomly assign women into different group compositions so that we could test whether being in the minority versus in the majority has an effect on various outcomes for women and men. So these are the different compositions in the middle here that we had. We had the 3F teams, which are teams consisting of 3 women and 2 men. So these are 5-person teams, if you recall. We had 1F teams, where there's only 1 woman and 4 men. And then because there's so many more men in the program, that necessitated creating some all-male teams as well. And so we have some of those, and we look at their behavior as well, but mostly focus on the first 2 the first 2 conditions. The 3F teams where women are in the majority, and the 1F teams where women are clearly in the minority. In fact, there's only 1 woman, so I'll call them the lone women teams. Okay, and then we track these students for the course of the semester, so over the next 4 months, and we observe a variety of outcomes about these students. So I'll talk about those outcomes more specifically, but are there any questions first, or any, I told Haley, feel free to interrupt me anytime if you have any questions or if you're confused. I'm more than happy to take those throughout before I talk about the outcomes. Okay, well, feel free to ask anytime. These are some things that we collect, some of the data that we collect on these students for the following 4 months, which is that intensive semester in which they interact in teams, and then also the following year in which they're in the program. So prior to being assigned randomly to a group composition, we have students complete a baseline survey so that we could know as much as possible about them. Their demographics, their prior leadership experience, their prerequisite GPAs as they come into the program. We also have them do a battery of attitudinal kinds of questions, things about their sexism attitudes, risk aversion, conflict avoidance. Those are sort of standard measures that are commonly considered as mediators in this literature in economics and social sciences. Then once a month, we have students complete peer evaluations of each other. And these are meant to mimic what you see in many organizations where employees evaluate their team members, or where there's something like a 360 review where you get to evaluate others that you work with. And specifically, we ask them a couple of questions. One is, who is the most influential member of your group? So think about the last month of you guys interacting with each other. Who was the most influential? Who was the least influential? And then who's the most and least supportive? And then we also ask them about how you think your group is doing. Are you enjoying being in the group, and so forth. At the end of their experience in the program, which is at the end of the 2nd year, we also collect a variety of outcomes about what happens to them at that point, which is, have they had an internship? Do they have a job lined up? We supplement that with some administrative data on their actual placements and grades and things like that. And then importantly, we also have these students come in to the laboratory. So this is a lab in the business school. You know, they're familiar with the setup, with the setting. And in this lab, they participate in a team building activity. And this activity is incentivized. So we use the incentive compatible method. It's not just some hypothetical, activity. We're able to actually see that their costs sort of are aligned with their incentives. And what we do is we have them come in twice a semester, once in the beginning and second time at the end, because we want to see what happens to these patterns over time, right? As groups get to know each other, as group members get to experience each other's, qualifications, do some of these gaps, potential gaps in influence, do they exacerbate over time, or potentially maybe they're ameliorated as teams get more comfortable with each other. So I'll quickly describe the team building exercise, and then if you have any questions, I can talk in more detail about it. But this is a common type of activity that you see in many different settings, both educational and labor force or labor market settings, where teams are brought, together to work on some collaborative, deliberative activity. In this case, the setup is everybody is told that they are stranded on the moon, hypothetically, and they have a list of items. There are 15 items, which is the second column of this table, and they have to rank them in the order of most to least important for survival on the moon. Okay, so all that the participants see is the middle column. They don't see the rank or the comment in the other columns. And the good thing about this task is that there is the right and wrong answers. So NASA provides an expert ranking, so we can actually compare how students do on this task relative to some objective measure of correctness in this case. And we have the students do this task first individually. So they do it on their own, and it's incentivized. So every the students who do the best get some monetary incentives. They get $50. It's just a 10-minute task, so it's a pretty good incentive for them. And then we have them deliberate together as a group. So in those same groups in which they are assigned to outside of the lab, they are in those same groups, and we ask them to talk about it for about 15 minutes and come up with a group ranking. So come up with a ranking that they submit, which again is going to be incentivized. And what we do during the deliberation is we record those so that we can actually see who is speaking, how long, who is being interrupted, who's contributing to the conversation, who's not. So that's one unique feature of our experimental setup. They submit the group ranking, and at the end of that, we ask them to select, as part of a survey, one member of the group who's going to represent the group or be the group spokesperson. The idea is they present this group ranking and they get additional money for the group. So there's an additional incentive for being the best spokesperson. And so they choose one person in the group to do so. Any questions about the task or the setup? Feel free to just interrupt. I wanted to just point out a couple of things. Oh, Haley, go ahead.
Yeah, I have two questions. First of all, how aware was everyone of exactly what the experiment was about?
Yeah, good question. So we do have informed consent, which means that students knew they're part of a research study. They had to sign a form saying they want to be part of it or they don't. There was one or two that decided that they didn't want to share their data with us. But that the way the research consent form was worded was very neutrally. So we say the study is about group dynamics. We are collaborating with the accounting program to evaluate group dynamics and understand how they evolve over time. No mention of gender, minority status, or anything like that was ever made. Now, students may have, of course, perceived that the study was about gender. And so at the end of the experiment, at the end of the second year, we asked them what they thought the experiment or the study was about. And about 10% of them mentioned gender, which is, maybe less than some of you might expect. The good thing is that percent doesn't vary by treatment condition. So it's about the same whether you're in the majority female group or in the minority female group, which is kind of what you worry about in terms of the validity of the results. The rest perceive the study to be about group team dynamics, group sort of workings, and all the questions that we ask in surveys too are very neutral as possible. So we never ask anything specifically related to gender unless these are, sexism type questions that we try to bury in a battery of other standardized type questions to be less explicit.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then my other question, which it looks like you're going to touch on, was the racial diversity of the group.
Yeah, so very little, unfortunately, racial diversity. This program is predominantly white, as you can see. We wish so much that we had more ethnic or racial diversity in the data so we could say something about whether this kind of result is only about gender, whether this kind of result generalizes to being in the minority, regardless of gender, right? But perhaps being in the racial minority. Unfortunately, with these data, we can't say very much about it, but we do have some discussions with a firm right now where we are hoping to pilot an experiment where the randomization would be around race as opposed to gender, so that we could in fact confirm whether these results generalize to other kinds of diversity.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Any time, feel free to ask. And then one thing I wanted to point out, this is what we call summary statistics, just to show you kind of the average distribution, of students by age, by race. Here's GPA, which is their grade point average. I wanted just to point out that the women and the man, so the 1F female is the average GPA for women in the 1F groups, and then the 3F female is the average GPA for women in the majority female groups, and then these are corresponding values for men. But you can see here clearly that the men and the women in this program are not very different. They come in with equal sort of qualifications, equally well qualified. This is a very competitive program, hard to get in. And the women are certainly exhibiting, very high qualifications. When you look at leadership experience, which we measure as prior high school or college or community leadership experience, we also see that these women come highly qualified. If anything, they're perhaps even more qualified than men in terms of prior leadership. So this is something to keep in mind, that these women are not systematically different. They are equally qualified, equally excellent in terms of their sort of prerequisite qualifications. So I'm going to show you some results now on the different outcomes. This is our very first result. And the outcome here is peer evaluations. So this is, if you remember, at the end of the laboratory task, we ask the students, who was the most influential member on this task? Okay, and these are what these bars represent. I'll explain that because it's a little bit confusing. So the yellow bar or the orange is the proportion of women in the group who are chosen to be the most influential relative to their proportion in the group. Okay, so we want to normalize everything by the number of women in the group, because the number of women here is 3, the number of women is 1. So to have an apples to apples comparison, everything is normalized by the number of women in the group. And so 1 would mean, this dotted line at 1 would mean that women are chosen as most influential proportional to their number in the group. Okay. That's what 1 would mean. And you can see clearly that for both minority women, which is the blue bar, and the majority women, it's below 1, that women are always disproportionately less likely to be chosen as most influential relative to men. Okay, but that gap is especially wide for women in the minority. In fact, when we compare these two bars, we find that the difference to be statistically significant, meaning that the women when they're the lone women in the group are significantly less likely to be chosen as influential relative to the women in the majority female condition. Okay. The opposite is true when we ask about who is the least influential. So all of a sudden, women are now disproportionately more likely to be chosen as the least influential. And that's especially true for the women in the minority condition. Okay, so that's our first result. Now you may say, well, these are just kind of evaluations by the group members. They're not really incentivized. So does this actually hold up in more maybe consequential incentivized evaluations of influence? Things like spokesperson decision. And I'm going to skip the regression tables. I'm guessing nobody really is interested, but this is just to show you, we confirm everything, all of these results that I show you, we confirm through a more rigorous regression analysis where we include a number of controls that you may think, would matter for this. So average age or average GPA, we include all of those. And as you can see, the estimate is about half a vote. So that means when a woman is in the minority group, she is going to receive about half a vote less on average for being the most influential relative to the women in the majority group. So this is what this 0.5 tells us. But so then, yeah, go ahead.
Were the participants asked to self-report their own perceptions of their own influentialness?
That's a good.
Is that relevant?
Oh, I think that would be a really cool thing to ask is, we did ask them, how confident are you in your task ability? Because we can measure, how well they do, but we also want to control for their confidence levels. So we do ask them about that, but we never did ask them how influential they perceived others would perceive them, right, which I think would be really interesting to control for. We do include the confidence control, but this a little bit different, right? The confidence in your task ability versus what you think, how you think others are evaluating you. But when we do include the controls for confidence levels, we don't find that to change very much. So it doesn't seem to be driven, at least, by confidence in the task ability.
Okay, thank you.
But that's a really good point. We did not think to do that. So on this more consequential decision of who is selected to be the spokesperson, so you can think about this decision as, in a company setting, who gets to present the results of the project to the boss, or who gets to interact with the client. These are, consequential decisions that lead to differences in promotion, in wages, often in raises. And so we try to mimic that spokesperson decision after something like that. And what we find is, again, very similar patterns, that when women are in the minority, which is the blue bar, they are significantly less likely to be chosen as the spokesperson for the group relative to the equally qualified women when they're in the majority. So remember, women are randomly assigned here to group conditions. So on average, they're the same. They're in terms of their, ability and qualifications, and yet we find these really striking gaps in their ability to exert influence, in how they're evaluated, and whether they're chosen to represent the group as a spokesperson. So in this study, we also are able to explore a number of mechanisms. Why is this happening? Why are we observing this result? So in particular, we look at, are women in the minority just worse at the task? Maybe they feel that, being the lone woman in the group gives the stereotype threat effect, where they're just not doing as well on the task. And we're able to rule that out. These women are doing just as well on the task. It's that their excellence on the task isn't converting to their influence in the same way as it does for the majority women groups. We also look at this idea that, well, perhaps women just need to lean in more, right? You've all probably heard of Sheryl Sandberg's work and related sort of advice to women that they just need to participate more in the process, speak up for themselves, self-promote. In this case, what we can measure is we can actually look at speaking time and speaking turns, because we record their deliberations during the task. And what we find is women in the minority are not speaking any less than when women are in the majority. So they're already leaning into the process just as much. And yet, again, that's not converting to the same kind of influence for them. So the leaning in advice doesn't seem to be an effective solution in this particular context in our study. And in fact, there's more and more evidence in this literature suggesting that that doesn't seem to be an effective solution across many different environments and contexts, and can in fact backfire for women oftentimes as well. We'll look at their propensity to self-promote as well, because one of the things we allow them to do is to vote for themselves as the most influential. And we find that, again, that's not able to explain the huge gaps that we can see in influence between the lone women and the women in the majority. So it's not that the women in the majority all of a sudden feel more empowered to vote for themselves and, you know, self-promote. That's not what we find. And finally, we look at sort of the idea of homophily, which is whether, you know, in the 3F teams, when there's 3 women in the group, women have the ability to vote for other women. And so that may be potentially explaining some of these differences that we observe across groups. And we find that that's not, that again, isn't a primary explanation or even close, that yes, women are more likely, of course, to vote for other women when there is an opportunity to do so, but it's actually men that are changing their behavior at much higher rates than women's sort of probability of voting for another woman or for herself. So the takeaway by looking at all of these different mechanisms is that we're able to rule out the first 4. What we can't rule out and what we clearly observe is that men's propensity to vote for women as influential and evaluate them as influential does vary depending on whether they're surrounded by women in the minority or women in the majority. They change their voting behavior positively when women are in the majority in these groups. Yeah, Haley, go ahead.
How do you, so because if I am a woman in a 3F team, like you mentioned, I have more of an opportunity to vote for women, but as a woman in a 1F team, like I could only vote for myself, which seems like a confounding factor in that. So I guess, how do you kind of suss out the difference between voting for a woman versus being kind of unwilling to vote for myself?
Yeah, so in a longer slide deck, I have a nice little graphic to illustrate that, but I'll try to just describe it so I don't take the time to find it. And basically we look at, what's the random probability of a woman being voted as the most influential in the 1F team versus the 3F team. And it turns out, because there's 2 decisions, right? We do the lab in the beginning of the semester and the one at the end of the semester. It turns out that probability for the 1F groups is exactly 36%. And it's 84% for the 3F groups, because there are 3 women across 2 different labs, okay? So then we compare what's the actual observed chance that a woman gets chosen to be the most influential in the 1F groups relative to the 2F groups. And in the 2F groups, we can see it by gender, right? We can look at the men and the women. We can see that both the men and the women increase their likelihood to vote for a random woman, but it is disproportionately more driven by men, almost entirely driven by men's behavior. I hope that makes sense. The graphic is a lot clearer, so I'll point you to the paper if you're interested in more detail as well on that.
No, that makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks, of course. So one question that I sort of asked in the beginning of this presentation is, well, what happens over time? Do we see improvement, or do we see this gap actually exacerbating as time goes by? And I'll point you to this graph on the right-hand side for that answer, which is, you can see that the confidence intervals here are really huge. So that means we don't have a ton of data to answer that question very precisely. So not putting a lot of weight on these results, but suggestively, what these show is that outcomes for women do seem to be improving over time. There's some evidence, some suggestive evidence that it gets better, that women are being evaluated as more influential as time goes by in the semester. So from September to December, this gap seems to be closing. However, I would point out that when we look at more task-specific assessments of influence, not just based on the surveys that we do once a month, but based on actual laboratory assessments, the difference between the beginning and the end of the semester, we don't find the same effect. That gap doesn't seem to be closing for women in the minority. In fact, if anything, it opens up a little bit, or remains about the same, depending on how confident you are in these not very precise data. Lastly, I just wanted to quickly point out that when we look at academic outcomes, so grades at the end of the semester and at the end of the year, the school year for these students, we do not find any differences in performance for men and women, regardless of their condition to which they were assigned. This, however, I would say, a couple of caveats. One is grades are largely group-based in this program. And so it may not be surprising that there's no difference across conditions because, or genders, because so much of the grade depends on overall group performance. And the second caveat is that we don't know how women are getting to these grades, or men, right? It is possible, based on these results that we observe with regards to influence, that women are having to work extra hard to earn the same grades, for example. So we don't have a lot of behind the scenes on how much time, for example, women are putting in to get those grades, right, relative to men. This is something that would have been nice to observe as well. And so I would just mention that even when you don't observe differences in outcomes in sort of, very obvious outcomes like grades, that doesn't mean that there aren't more nuanced gender gaps. And clearly what our study shows is those gaps with regards to influence do exist, and are sometimes difficult to observe. They don't show up on evaluations like grades or job performance or job placements. So just to summarize, across a variety of different outcomes, we find that women's participation and influence in teams is very different when they are in the minority relative to when they're in the majority. So in particular, they are ranked as by other team members as less influential. They are also less likely to be selected as the spokesperson to represent the team. And as such, are less likely to actually exert empirical influence. This influence, as we show, cannot be explained by things like self-votes, homophily, women's lack of competence on the task, which tends to be, a common explanation, anecdotal explanation, or their failure to lean in. Over time, we do see some improvement, but especially when we look at these general assessments of influence with regards to monthly surveys, but we don't see the same kind of improvement on task-specific assessments. So that picture, again, is a lot more muddy. We would say there's more research that needs to be done to understand whether these patterns improve or worsen over time for women in the minority. And I will stop here, and I will be happy to take any questions that you have, and look forward to the discussion.